My niece called 3 days before Christmas and asked, "Aunt Audrey, can you feed Jasper while we're at the mountain house?" I laughed because I thought she meant her parents. Then she started naming people Grandpa, Uncle Daniel, the cousins, everyone. Everyone except me. She went quiet and asked, "Wait, why aren't you coming with everyone?" I had no answer. When I finally asked Dad, he didn't pretend it was an oversight. We wanted one Christmas without the tension you bring. So I stayed away. By Christmas morning, they finally understood what "without me" actually meant. Stay with me, because that innocent question from an 11-year-old changed the way I saw my entire family. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and keep listening. It was December 22nd, and I was sitting at my desk trying to finish the last pieces of work standing between me and Christmas break. The nonprofit where I worked had technically closed for the holidays at noon, but project coordinators learn quickly that closed usually means everyone else leaves while you make sure January does not begin on fire. I had a half-finished grant calendar open on one screen, 3 sticky notes under my coffee mug, and a cardboard box of decorations beside my chair that I had been meaning to take home for 2 days. My phone lit up with Molly's name. She was 11 and had been calling me directly for years, usually about things that seemed urgent only if you were 11, whether I thought purple braces looked weird, whether her mother would notice if she cut her own bangs, whether Jasper understood birthdays. I liked that she called me without needing Beth to arrange it. There was something uncomplicated about being Aunt Audrey. Molly never needed me to interpret a silence at a dinner table or explain what Dad really meant. She just wanted answers about cats and school projects and whether 12 was too old for glow-in-the-dark stars on a bedroom ceiling. That afternoon, her emergency was Jasper. She asked whether I could feed him while they were gone, and immediately began giving me instructions as if I had never encountered a cat before. Jasper got half a scoop in the morning and half at night. His water bowl needed to be filled all the way because he would refuse to drink from it once it dropped below some invisible standard known only to him. If I sat on the couch, he might pretend not to care that I was there, but I should stay for a few minutes anyway, because he got lonely. I agreed before she finished explaining. Beth lived less than 20 minutes from my condo, and I had no plans that would take me out of town. Molly sounded relieved. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned how excited she was about the mountain house. I smiled at the phrase. Beth and Ryan had taken her on short winter trips before, and Molly called almost any rental with snow outside a mountain house. I pictured the 3 of them somewhere in Wisconsin, Ryan trying to light a fireplace while Beth complained about wet boots in the entryway. I asked when they were leaving. The answer came easily, the 23rd. Grandpa wanted everyone there before dinner. My hand stopped over the keyboard. For a second, I assumed she meant Ryan's father. Then Molly kept talking. Uncle Daniel was bringing board games. Aunt Erica had apparently promised hot chocolate. Owen and Mason had already claimed the room with bunk beds. Grandpa Howard had told everyone he wanted phones put away during Christmas dinner. The names collected in my head one at a time, until there was nowhere left for misunderstanding to hide. My father, my brother Daniel, his wife, and both of their boys. Beth, Ryan, and Molly. Everyone. I looked at the December calendar pinned beside my desk. Christmas Day was circled in red because I had kept it open the way I always did. Nobody had asked whether I was free because nobody normally needed to. For years, Christmas had been treated as a family default, not an invitation. Molly must have noticed that I had stopped making the little sounds adults make when children are telling long stories. Her voice lost some of its excitement. "Wait, Aunt Audrey, why aren't you coming with everyone?" The question was so simple that it hurt more than an accusation would have. I stared at the row of sticky notes beneath my monitor while my mind searched for an explanation, gentle enough for an 11-year-old. I could have asked who told her I was not coming. I could have asked whether Grandpa had said anything about me. I could have made her carry information she was never supposed to be responsible for. Instead, I told her I must have missed part of the planning and moved us back to Jasper. I asked where Beth would leave the spare key, and whether his food was still in the pantry by the laundry room. Molly relaxed almost immediately. To her, an adult saying she had missed something was explanation enough. By the time the call ended, I knew the feeding schedule, the location of Jasper's favorite toy, and exactly how long Molly thought I should sit with him so he would not feel abandoned. I knew nothing about why my family was spending Christmas together without me. For several minutes, I did nothing. The office around me had gone almost completely quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cleaning cart rattled over a doorway strip. The heating system clicked behind the wall. My grant calendar was still open, but the words had flattened into meaningless blocks. I went back through the previous month in my head before I touched my phone again. There had been Thanksgiving at Dad's, a tense moment with Daniel's son Owen. An argument between Dad and me that had lasted longer than it should have. Beth had spoken to me afterward. But there had been no conversation about Christmas plans, no invitation I had rejected, no moment when I had said I wanted to be alone, no mention of a rental in Wisconsin. I called Beth because I still wanted the answer to be boring. She was packing. I could hear drawers opening and closing, and Molly moving somewhere in the background. Beth sounded distracted until I mentioned the mountain house. Then the movement on her end seemed to stop. She had not expected me to know. I did not accuse her. I simply told her Molly had asked me to feed Jasper and had mentioned who was going. Beth responded with the careful tone people use when they are trying to cross a floor they have just realized is covered in broken glass. She said she thought I had other plans for Christmas. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. I asked where she had gotten that idea. Beth hesitated before explaining that Dad had told them I needed space after Thanksgiving and had already made Christmas plans of my own. Apparently, he had presented it as settled enough that nobody thought there was anything left to discuss. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my desk until the wood dug into it. I had never told Dad I needed space. I had never told him I had plans. In fact, Dad and I had barely spoken since Thanksgiving, beyond a short exchange about a package delivered to his house by mistake. Beth knew from my silence that something was wrong. She began saying that she had assumed Dad and I had worked things out between us, that he made it sound as if I had chosen not to come, that she had not realized I stopped listening to the explanations as separate sentences. They all led to the same place. She had never asked me. That hurt almost as much as the lie itself. I told Beth I was not going to discuss it while Molly was nearby. I asked only one thing before ending the call. Whether Molly was excited about the trip. Beth said she was. I told her to let Molly enjoy it. Then I sat alone in the empty office with my phone in my hand. There was one person left who could tell me whether this was a misunderstanding, a lie, or something worse. I called my father. He answered on the third ring. His voice was calm, familiar, completely untouched by the fact that I had just discovered I was the only member of our family missing from Christmas. I told him Molly had called. There was a small pause. I told him, Beth said, he had told everyone I had other plans. Another pause, longer this time. I asked whether I had actually been invited to the mountain house. Dad did not rush to deny anything. I could hear the faint scrape of a chair against his kitchen floor, then his breath settling as though he had been waiting for a conversation he had hoped would happen later. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost gentle. I think we need to talk about why you weren't invited. For a moment after Dad said it, I thought I had misheard him, not because the words were unclear, but because he had delivered them with the same calm tone he used when discussing weather delays or a change in dinner reservations. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation that suggested guilt, no attempt to soften what he had just admitted. I was standing beside my desk in the empty office, one hand resting on the back of my chair, listening to my father explain why my entire family had been invited to Christmas except me. He said the decision had not been made impulsively. Thanksgiving had left everyone exhausted, and he believed we needed a holiday that did not turn into another argument. He spoke about it as though he had been forced to solve a practical problem no one else had the courage to address. The more reasonable he tried to sound, the colder the room seemed to become around me. Then he said the sentence I would hear again in my head for days. We wanted one Christmas, without the tension you bring. My fingers tightened around the chair. If he had shouted, I might have shouted back. If he had called me selfish or ungrateful, I would have known where to put the anger. But Dad was doing something he had always been good at. He was presenting judgment as common sense. He was not excluding his daughter. He was protecting Christmas. He was not lying about my plans. He was preventing unnecessary conflict. And somehow, in the version he was giving me, my absence was not a punishment. It was a favor to everyone else. I asked whether Beth and Daniel had agreed that I should not be invited. Dad did not answer directly. Instead, he said, people had been tired of walking on eggshells, tired of wondering which comment would become another issue, tired of having every family dinner feel as though one wrong sentence could turn into a confrontation. The phrasing bothered me more than the accusation itself. People. Everyone. The family. He kept speaking for a room full of adults who had apparently lost the ability to speak for themselves. I asked why nobody had simply told me. Dad exhaled slowly, and I could picture him leaning back at his kitchen table, pinching the bridge of his nose the way he did whenever he wanted the person across from him to feel unreasonable before the conversation had even finished. He said telling me Demon would have turned the decision into another debate. According to him, that was the problem. Nothing could ever simply happen if I disagreed with it. I had to examine it, challenge it, ask why, ask who had decided, ask whether somebody had been hurt. The absurdity of it made heat rise into my face. They had hidden a family Christmas from me because they did not want conflict, and Dad was using the fact that I objected to being hidden from as proof that hiding it had been necessary. I almost said exactly that. The words reached the back of my teeth and stopped there. Something in me had already begun to recognize the shape of the conversation. I had been in it too many times. Dad would make a decision. I would challenge the way he made it. He would stop defending the decision and start defending himself from me. By the end, nobody remembered what had started the argument. They only remembered that Dad and Audrey had argued again. That realization did not make me less angry. It made me tired. Dad moved on to Thanksgiving. He reminded me of what happened with Owen, though he described it differently than I would have. In Dad's version, he had made a harmless observation about a 16-year-old quitting football. I had jumped in before Daniel could respond. I had embarrassed Daniel in front of his own son. Then, when Dad tried to explain himself, I had refused to let the subject die. There were parts of that version I could dismiss immediately. Dad's comment had not been harmless. Owen had gone silent at the table, and I had seen the way his shoulders folded inward when Grandpa turned a decision about football into a verdict on his character. But there was another part I could not dismiss so easily. Daniel had told me afterward that he could handle his own son. Beth had said something similar, though more gently. Dad must have known that because he pressed exactly where the bruise already existed. Sometimes people can handle their own problems without you. The sentence landed differently than everything else he had said. I looked down at the sticky notes scattered beneath my coffee mug. One of them reminded me to follow up with a venue manager in January. Another had the name of a volunteer who needed a new schedule. Small problems, clear problems, the kind I knew how to fix. Family had never been that clean. I thought of all the times I had stepped between Dad and somebody else because I could see where the conversation was going. All the times I had redirected his attention toward me because I knew I could take it. All the follow-up calls afterward, when I checked whether Beth was okay, or told Daniel not to take Dad's comments personally, I had always thought of that as helping. For the first time, I wondered how often everyone else had experienced it as me taking over. Dad continued talking, but the force had gone out of my need to answer him. He was still wrong about what he had done. I knew that much. You did not protect a family by quietly removing one person and inventing a reason for her absence. You did not tell everyone she had other plans when she did not. But the fact that Dad had behaved badly did not automatically make every accusation about me false. That was the part I had not expected. He seemed to mistake my silence for agreement and began explaining that he hoped a little distance might be good for everyone. After Christmas, when things had settled down, maybe we could all start fresh. The phrase almost made me laugh. Start fresh, as though I had spilled something across the family, and he was giving me time to clean it up. I looked through the darkened office windows. My reflection hovered faintly over the glass, coat still hanging on the hook beside me, cardboard decorations untouched by my chair. A few minutes earlier, I had been angry enough to imagine driving to Beth's house and demanding to know why nobody had bothered to ask me the truth. Now, the anger had changed shape. It was still there, but underneath it sat something far less comfortable. Doubt. Dad was waiting for me to fight. I could hear it in the pauses he left after each sentence, openings he expected me to fill. He knew how this usually worked. I would challenge one detail. He would defend another. We would drag Thanksgiving into Christmas, then Christmas backward through 6 years of old arguments, until neither of us could remember which wound belonged to which day. I did not give him that. I told him I understood what he was asking for. The silence on his end was immediate. He had prepared himself for resistance, not acceptance. I said I would not come to the mountain house. I would not call Beth or Daniel and demand explanations. I would not make Molly feel as though she had done something wrong by telling me. The only commitment I intended to keep was the one I had already made to my niece. I would feed Jasper while they were gone. Dad dismissed the cat with a small sound, as if that detail had nothing to do with the larger issue. Molly had asked me for something before I knew I was being excluded. My promise to her did not become less real, because her grandfather had hurt me. I ended the call before Dad could turn my agreement into another lecture about maturity. The office was completely silent afterward. I gathered my things slowly. I shut down the computer, stacked the sticky notes, put the decorations into the cardboard box. Ordinary movements kept my hands occupied while my mind returned to the same question. What if they really were happier without me? I hated how quickly the thought found places to attach itself. Thanksgiving. Daniel telling me I had stepped in too fast. Beth saying, I sometimes decided what other people needed before they said it themselves. Dad accusing everyone of walking on eggshells. I knew he had lied about my plans. I knew excluding me without a conversation was cruel, but certainty about his behavior did not give me certainty about mine. By the time I turned off the office light, I no longer knew what frightened me more: that my father had convinced the family I was the problem, or that Christmas without me might prove he was right. The first thing I did when I got home was put the cardboard box of office decorations on the floor beside my front door and leave it there. I had carried it in with both hands, set it down carefully, and then stood over it as if I had forgotten what boxes were for. The apartment was quiet, except for the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. Outside, headlights slid across the living room ceiling as cars moved through the wet December streets below. I should have changed clothes, made dinner, done something ordinary enough to prove the evening had not rearranged anything inside me. Instead, I kept hearing Dad's sentence, "Sometimes people can handle their own problems without you." It was the one accusation I could not dismiss, simply because of who had delivered it. Dad had lied about my Christmas plans. He had deliberately excluded me and then built an explanation around my absence so no one would question it. None of that became acceptable because I had flaws of my own. Still, there was a reason those particular words had found their mark. Thanksgiving had been less than 4 weeks earlier. That was where Dad wanted me to look, so I finally did. The day had started normally enough. Dad hosted because he always hosted Thanksgiving after Mom died. He liked ritual because ritual made a family look intact from the outside. The same dining table, the same serving bowls, the same insistence that dinner begin at the exact time he had announced, even though half the food was never ready then. Daniel and Erica had come with Owen and Mason. Beth arrived with Ryan and Molly. I brought a pie, and the salad Dad always claimed nobody touched, even though the bowl was empty every year. For most of the afternoon, nothing happened that would have seemed important to anyone watching us from a distance. Mason argued with Molly about a card game. Ryan carved the turkey because Dad's wrist had been bothering him. Daniel spent too long describing some home improvement project nobody had asked about. I remember standing near the kitchen counter, drying a serving spoon with a dish towel, and thinking that maybe we were going to make it through a holiday without one of Dad's remarks landing harder than he intended. Then he asked Owen about football. Owen was 16, tall enough that Dad had been talking about his athletic build since he was 13. He had played varsity football that fall, but sometime before Thanksgiving, he had decided not to continue. There had been no injury, no disciplinary issue, no dramatic incident. He simply did not enjoy it anymore. Robotics had taken over most of his interest, and school had become more demanding. Daniel and Erica had let him make the decision. When Dad asked whether winter conditioning had started, Owen explained that he was done with the team. Dad looked up from his plate. At first, he made it sound like teasing. He said kids gave things up too quickly now, that sometimes staying with something after it stopped being fun was how character got built. Daniel gave a small laugh, the kind he used when he hoped a comment would disappear if he treated it as harmless enough. Owen did not laugh. He stared at the food on his plate, turning his fork once between his fingers. Dad kept going. He said commitment meant finishing what you started. He wondered aloud whether robotics was simply easier because nobody was hitting Owen on a field. The words were wrapped in humor, but I could see what was happening. Owen's shoulders had folded slightly toward the table. Erica glanced at Daniel. Daniel looked back at Dad and still said nothing. I waited longer than I remembered waiting. In my memory, I had always told myself I stepped in, because no one else would. Sitting alone in my apartment weeks later, I could see that there had been a gap before I spoke. Maybe Daniel had been deciding how to answer. Maybe Erica had been waiting for the right moment. Maybe Owen had wanted to answer for himself. I had never given any of them enough time to find out. I told Dad to stop turning a teenager's decision into a judgment about what kind of person he was. The room changed immediately. Dad leaned back as though I had accused him of something far more serious than making an ugly joke. He said he was only trying to teach Owen that quitting had consequences. I said Owen had changed priorities, not abandoned a family in the middle of a crisis. Dad said I was exaggerating. I said he was humiliating his grandson at Thanksgiving. By then, the conversation was no longer about football. That was the part I had failed to notice at the time. Daniel tried to interrupt once, but I was already moving faster than everyone else. Dad had started defending his right to make the comment. I had started defending Owen. Each answer created the next answer. The more Dad minimized what he had said, the more determined I became to make him acknowledge it. Then Daniel put his fork down. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend Dad either. He looked at me and said, "I can handle my own son." The words stopped me harder than anything Dad had said. I remember the heat rising up the back of my neck. I had been so focused on protecting Owen from Dad that I had not noticed Daniel now felt judged by me too. Not because I thought he was a bad father. I did not. But my intervention had carried its own message. You are not handling this quickly enough, so I will. Dad seized the opening. He shifted away from Owen almost instantly. Now the problem was my tone, my inability to let things go, my habit of turning every comment into a moral emergency. Owen disappeared from the center of the conversation. Daniel no longer had to decide whether to challenge Dad about what he had said. Erica no longer had to choose whether to support Daniel publicly. Beth found a reason to ask Ryan about something in the kitchen. Within minutes, the argument belonged entirely to Dad and me. That had always felt, to me, like failure. Another holiday spoiled, another unnecessary fight. Only now could I see what the shift had done. Owen was no longer being criticized. Daniel no longer had to decide whether to challenge Dad. And Dad no longer had to answer anyone except me. I knew exactly how to fight with him. We had years of practice. Eventually the conversation burned itself out, because most fights between Dad and me did. He became quieter and more wounded. I became sharper and more exhausted. Someone cleared plates. Someone mentioned dessert. The family moved on. Later, while helping Beth wrap leftovers in the kitchen, she had said something I barely let myself hear at the time. "You were right about Dad, but sometimes you step in before the rest of us decide what we want to do." I had been defensive enough that I treated the sentence like an unfair compromise, as if Beth were trying to split responsibility down the middle just to keep peace. I reminded her that Owen had looked miserable. She agreed. She also pointed out that Daniel was his father, not me. Daniel was blunter before he left. He thanked me for caring about Owen, then told me he hated feeling as though I had taken over his place at his own table. I had carried those comments home from Thanksgiving and filed them under things said when everyone was tired. Dad, apparently, had filed them somewhere else. Standing in my kitchen now, I filled a glass with water and watched condensation collect against my fingers. The easy conclusion would have been that Dad had twisted Thanksgiving into an excuse for cruelty. He had, but that was not the whole truth. The whole truth was more uncomfortable. Dad had been wrong to humiliate Owen. I had been right to recognize it, and I had still stepped in so fast that I prevented Daniel from deciding how he wanted to protect his own son. Those things could exist at the same time. I had spent years believing that if I could see harm coming, I had a responsibility to stop it. Maybe that belief had begun after Mom died. Maybe it had started earlier. I could not trace it neatly enough to blame one moment. What I could see was the pattern it created. Dad pushed. I stepped in. Everyone else stepped back. Then Dad blamed me for the collision. I sat at my kitchen table until the water in my glass turned warm. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I did not step in at all. Not to prove Dad wrong. Not to punish Beth or Daniel. Not to force anyone to choose me. Just to let the adults in my family handle their own relationships without me reaching into the middle first. The thought frightened me because it removed the one role I knew how to perform. It also felt, in a way I did not yet trust, like relief. By the time I went to bed, I had made one decision. I would not spend Christmas proving my father wrong. The next morning, the decision I had made in the quiet of my kitchen looked less noble and more like an empty calendar. For weeks, I had kept Christmas open without thinking about it. I had declined a couple of casual invitations because I assumed I would be with my family. I had not bought groceries for a holiday meal at home. I had not planned to travel. I had not even asked what time dinner would be, because Bennett Christmas had always operated on the same unspoken rule. Whatever else changed, we showed up. Now, December 23rd was circled on my wall calendar with nothing beside it, and Christmas Eve was nearly blank. I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee cooling between my hands and looked at the squares as though they belonged to somebody else. The practical problem was small. I was 35 years old. I had food, a home, friends, transportation. I was perfectly capable of spending Christmas by myself. What unsettled me was how embarrassed I felt by the idea of anyone knowing why. Being excluded at 35 felt different from being excluded at 15. There was no cafeteria table to avoid the next day, no hallway where everybody could see who had been invited and who had not. Adults were supposed to have enough life around them that one family decision could not leave an entire holiday empty. Mine had. I considered buying enough groceries for one elaborate dinner and turning the day into something intentional. I considered leaving the city for 24 hours. Mostly, I considered telling no one anything. Leah ruined that plan before noon. She had been my friend long enough to notice when I became too efficient. I was answering a question she had called about something ordinary involving a January event at work when I heard myself giving her information in the clipped, organized tone I used whenever I was trying to keep emotion outside the edges of a conversation. She stopped me somewhere in the middle. I did not tell her every detail. I did not need to. I said my family had rented a place in Wisconsin for Christmas, that I had found out through Molly, and that Dad had decided everyone would be more comfortable if I stayed home. The silence on Leah's end lasted just long enough to tell me she was choosing her response. She did not call my father a monster. She did not tell me to drive to Wisconsin anyway. She did not suggest some dramatic counterattack that would make the holiday memorable for all the wrong reasons. She asked what I was doing Christmas Eve. I told her I had not decided. Leah had a small dinner planned at her place. Nothing formal. A few people, food, music, the kind of evening that apparently did not require a spreadsheet. She told me there was room for one more. My first instinct was not gratitude. It was logistics. I offered to bring dessert. Then I remembered she baked better than I did and switched to salad. When she said food was handled, I suggested I could come early and help set up. I was already thinking about whether she needed extra chairs when she interrupted me. Bring yourself. That's the whole assignment. I laughed because the sentence sounded ridiculous. Then I stopped laughing. There was no job tucked inside the welcome. For years, I had arrived early to family holidays because there was always something to do. An oven to check, a chair to pull out, a conversation to redirect before it reached the dining room. I had never thought of that as earning my place. Standing by my apartment window with Leah's words still in my ear, I was less certain. I told her I would come. After we hung up, I opened my refrigerator and stared at the groceries I had bought before any of this happened. Butter, eggs, vegetables. A bottle of wine I had assumed I would take to Dad's. Nothing that suggested a holiday for one person, but nothing tragic either. For once, I let the refrigerator close without turning the contents into a problem I needed to solve. Beth came by that afternoon before they left town. I had expected her to leave Jasper's spare key under a planter or hand it to me sometime earlier in the week, but she stopped at my condo on the way through a list of last-minute errands. She carried an envelope with the key inside and a small sheet of paper Molly had covered with oversized handwriting. There was nothing secret in it. Half a scoop in the morning, half at night. Fresh water. Check that the laundry room door stayed open because Jasper liked sleeping on a folded blanket in there. Molly had drawn a tiny orange cat at the bottom and added 3 underlined words. Sit with him, please. The note made something tighten behind my ribs. Beth stood near my entryway while I read it. She looked tired in the way people look the day before, leaving for a family trip coat half-zipped, hair pulled back too quickly, attention divided between the place she was standing and the next 3 things she needed to do. For several seconds, neither of us mentioned Dad. Then she gave me the kind of apology people offer when they know they have contributed to something but have not yet decided how much responsibility they are willing to claim. She said she was sorry everything had become so awkward and repeated that Dad had made it sound as though I had already decided not to come. When she added that she should probably have checked with me directly, she looked down at the envelope instead of at me. She kept the conversation moving toward Molly, packing, and the drive anything that did not require us to examine what Dad's lie meant before she left. I folded Molly's note once and slipped it back into the envelope. I asked whether she was excited. Beth understood I meant Molly. Her face softened. She said Molly had been talking about snow for 2 days, had packed too many books, and was mostly worried Jasper would spend Christmas convinced everyone had disappeared. That sounded like Molly. For a moment, Beth looked as if she wanted to say more. Her eyes moved toward the envelope in my hand, then back to my face. Whatever she was considering, she let it go. So did I. I wished them a safe drive. After she left, I placed the spare key in the small dish near my front door, where I kept things I could not afford to misplace. Later that afternoon, I knew roughly when the family would be leaving for Wisconsin. Beth had mentioned they wanted to reach the lodge before dinner, and the Baraboo Hills were about 3 hours away if winter traffic cooperated. I could picture the practical pieces without trying. Daniel loading bags into his car, Erica checking that Owen and Mason had packed everything, Molly asking whether they would see enough snow, Dad making sure people left on time. My phone stayed quiet. I caught myself thinking about the roads, the weather, and whether everyone had arrived before dinner, but none of those questions required me to act. I made coffee, cleaned the cardboard box of office decorations out of my entryway, answered 2 final work emails, and shut my laptop. By early evening, the Bennett family was somewhere north of me, driving toward a rented lodge where there would be snow outside, a fireplace inside, and every person normally present at Christmas except me. No one called. No one turned around. No one asked me to reconsider. For the first time in years, a Bennett family holiday was moving forward without me touching a single part of it. Dad had wanted one Christmas without the tension I brought. As the light disappeared beyond my apartment windows, he was getting exactly what he asked for. That first evening passed with an almost insulting lack of drama. After a quick grocery run, I came home to an apartment that felt too quiet, and a phone that had not rung once. For years, the day before a family holiday had been full of small requests, something to pick up, a time Dad had changed, a question Beth wanted answered. Now there was nothing. I caught myself wondering whether the drive had been easy and whether everyone had settled in, then left the phone in my coat pocket. I was not trying to stop caring about them. I was trying to learn that caring did not require me to monitor every detail. By early evening, darkness had settled over the city. I made something simple for dinner and left my phone face down beside my plate. The longer it stayed silent, the easier it became to imagine the lodge exactly as Dad had promised it would be. Snow at the windows, a fire going, everyone relaxed because I was not there to challenge the wrong remark. I knew silence proved only that nobody was contacting me, but the thought still found its way in. Maybe the evening really was easier without me. The possibility embarrassed me because part of me wanted my absence to be noticed, not through a disaster, just through some small sense that I had mattered. I washed the same glass twice before catching myself and set it in the rack. If I spent the night hunting for updates, every quiet hour would become evidence for whatever I already feared. I left the phone where it was. Later that evening, I drove to Beth's house for Jasper. The neighborhood was quiet, most driveways already lined with cars from visiting relatives. Colored lights reflected off thin patches of old snow along the lawns. Beth's house looked almost exactly as it always did, except every downstairs window was dark. I used the key she had given me and stepped inside. The silence there felt different from my apartment. My apartment was quiet because only I lived there. Beth's house was quiet because people who belonged there were somewhere else. Jasper appeared at the end of the hallway with the suspicious expression of a creature who clearly believed my presence required investigation. He stared at me, stretched one front paw forward, then turned and walked toward the kitchen as if he had decided I could follow. I remembered Molly's instructions, moved through Jasper's routine, and let the ordinary quiet of the house remain ordinary. A pair of Molly's sneakers sat crooked under a bench, one cereal bowl dried beside the sink, and a strand of silver garland had slipped from a bookshelf. Jasper ate, then followed me into the living room and sat several feet away. Molly had been very specific about sitting with him, so I sat. The couch dipped beneath me in the familiar place where Beth usually curled up with her feet tucked underneath her. Across the room, the Christmas tree stood unlit. Molly had hung ornaments low enough that Jasper could probably reach them if he tried, although apparently even he understood there were boundaries worth respecting. I almost laughed at that. My phone remained silent in my coat pocket. Jasper eventually crossed the rug and jumped onto the opposite end of the couch. He did not come closer. He simply settled there, eyes half closed, apparently satisfied that I had fulfilled my assignment. For once, the assignment had limits I could understand. Feed him, give him water, sit for a while, then leave. Nobody had asked me to fix anything else. When I locked the door behind me, the cold air caught in my lungs. I stood on Beth's front step for a moment and looked at the dark windows before walking back to my car. There were still no messages when I left. Driving home, I told myself that nothing happening was not evidence of anything. But by the time I turned off the lights that night, the thought I had been trying not to name had settled beside me in the dark. Maybe nothing happening was the answer. Christmas Eve morning arrived quietly enough that, for the first hour, I almost believed the night before had settled something in me. It had not. The question was still there when I woke up, but it had lost some of its sharpness. Maybe nothing happening really was the answer. Maybe the family was having exactly the peaceful holiday Dad said they needed. I still did not know. What had changed was that I was beginning to see how much of my life had been built around trying to know. I drove to Beth's house after breakfast to feed Jasper. The sky was pale and low, the kind of winter morning that made every parked car look dusted and gray. There had been no fresh snow overnight in the suburbs, only old patches hardened along the curb. Molly's neighborhood was unusually still. Christmas decorations blinked in windows, even though the sun was already up, and several porches were crowded with delivered packages waiting for people who were apparently home enough to receive them. Inside Beth's house, Jasper greeted me with less suspicion than the night before and followed me through his now familiar routine. Molly's decorations were everywhere: paper, snowflakes on the windows, a felt reindeer hanging crooked from a cabinet, a mug with a cartoon cat wearing antlers by the sink. I could picture her at the lodge talking too loudly about snow. The image hurt, but after sitting with Jasper for a few quiet minutes, I left. By the time I got back to my condo, I had a different problem. Leah's invitation had come with exactly one instruction: bring myself. Apparently, I still had to learn how to do that. I caught myself inventorying my refrigerator for something useful to bring and considering whether I should arrive early. Then I remembered Leah had already answered that question. I chose a small host gift I had bought earlier in December and left the rest alone. Leah's house that evening was warm in the particular way. Winter houses become warm when there are too many people in a small dining room. Nothing matched. Someone had left a scarf over the back of a chair. A serving spoon had disappeared and been replaced with a large soup spoon that clearly did not belong in the dish. Music played from somewhere near the kitchen, low enough that people did not have to compete with it. No one cared. That was what I noticed first. Not that everything was peaceful. It was not. Two people disagreed about what music should play after dinner. Somebody complained that a dish was too salty, and then ate a second helping anyway. Leah changed the order of a game because half the room wanted to stay at the table, and the other half wanted to move into the living room. Small disagreements rose and disappeared without leaving a wound behind them. Nobody watched the room after every joke. Nobody glanced toward one person to see whether a comment would become a problem. Nobody needed to be rescued from anybody else. For the first 20 minutes, I did not know what to do with my hands. I carried my own plate to the kitchen after eating and automatically began stacking other people's dishes. Leah took 2 plates from me, without making a point of it, and told me to go sit down. Normally, I would have argued that I was already standing. Instead, I went back to the table. The strange part was how quickly my body understood. Something my mind had been resisting all day. My shoulders dropped. I stopped tracking who needed another drink. I stopped noticing every pause in every conversation. At one point, 2 people disagreed sharply enough that the room went quiet for several seconds, and I felt the familiar impulse rise in me to make a joke, ask a question, redirect attention. I did nothing. One of them explained what they had meant. The other answered. The conversation moved on. The room survived. I almost smiled. Watching the disagreement resolve without me made Beth's Thanksgiving warning feel less theoretical. Sometimes the hardest part of not stepping in was simply tolerating the uncertainty of what other people would do next. My phone rang while I was helping Leah carry coffee into the living room. Beth's name appeared on the screen. The change inside me was immediate. Every bit of ease I had managed to build vanished at once. My first thought was Molly. I stepped away from the group and moved toward the short hallway near Leah's front door, where the music softened into background noise. By the time I answered, I was already bracing for something involving a child, a car, an accident, some practical emergency that would make every decision I had made about boundaries suddenly irrelevant. Beth did not sound panicked. She sounded exhausted. Her voice was low, but behind it I could hear raised voices, not words at first, just the unmistakable rhythm of people talking over one another in a room too small for the anger inside it. I pressed the phone more tightly to my ear. Beth told me Molly was fine. That was the first thing she said that mattered. The relief moved through me so quickly that I had to lean one shoulder against the wall. Then Beth gave me the compressed version of what had happened. Dad had started criticizing Molly earlier in the day. Nothing enormous. Nothing that would sound dramatic when repeated later. A comment about attitude. then another about how Beth corrected her. Beth had tried to let the first one pass. When he kept going, she told him to stop. Dad did not stop. He turned the criticism toward Beth. According to him, she had become too sensitive. Everything had to be treated like an insult now. Every correction became an argument. People could not say anything without somebody making it bigger than it needed to be. I closed my eyes. The words were familiar enough that I did not need Beth to explain why she had called me. Then she repeated the line that had finally pushed her out of the room. Dad had accused her of bringing tension into everything. For a second, I heard nothing behind Beth's voice, except the hum of Leah's house, through the wall and my own breathing. The label had moved. I did not know what Daniel had said or how long the argument had been going. I only knew that I was 3 hours away, exactly where Dad had wanted me, and somehow the same words had found someone else. Beth's voice dropped even lower. She said everyone was talking past each other now. Dad was angry. Daniel was irritated. Ryan had tried to calm things down. Nothing was helping. I felt the old machinery inside me wake up before she even finished. My mind was already arranging people into positions. Dad would respond better if someone acknowledged his intention before challenging his behavior. Beth needed to stop defending every individual comment and name the pattern instead. Daniel would probably joke if the room got too tense. If I called Dad separately, I could get him out of performance mode before I stopped. The thoughts had arrived so automatically that for several seconds I had not even noticed what I was doing. I was standing in Leah's hallway, mentally rebuilding a family room in Wisconsin I had never entered, preparing to manage people who had specifically chosen to spend Christmas without me. Beth went quiet. I knew that silence too. She was waiting for me to do what I always did. Then she asked the question, "Can you just talk to Dad?" The question hung between us longer than it should have. For years, a request like that would have moved through me like muscle memory. I knew how to lower my voice, how to give Dad room to retreat without admitting he had been wrong, how to let his anger shift toward me until everyone else could breathe again. My mind had already begun building that conversation before I made a conscious decision. That frightened me more than Beth's call. I pressed my fingertips against the cool wall beside me and forced myself to listen to what she had actually said instead of what I had been trained to do with it. Molly was fine. No one was hurt, stranded, or sick. They were adults in a house having an argument. I asked Beth directly whether anyone was unsafe. She sounded confused by the question at first, then said no. Dad was angry. Daniel was angry. Ryan had tried to keep things from getting worse. Molly had been moved away from the argument. There was no emergency, beyond the fact that the evening had become miserable. For most of my adult life, misery had been enough to activate me. If Beth was crying or Daniel sounded frustrated, I moved toward the problem before anyone had asked me to. Now I was standing in another person's house, listening to a conflict 3 hours away that existed without me. And still, they wanted me inside it. Beth explained that Dad was no longer listening to anyone. He kept insisting everyone had misunderstood him, then becoming more defensive every time someone challenged his tone. She believed he would listen to me because, even when we fought, I knew how to make him stop long enough to hear a point. The irony was almost unbearable. They had left me out because I supposedly made every problem bigger. Now the problem was big, and the first solution Beth reached for was me. I did not feel vindicated. I felt tired. Behind the closed door at the end of the hallway, I could hear a burst of laughter from Leah's living room. Somebody dropped something light enough that no one sounded alarmed. Music changed. Life continued without asking me to manage it. Thanksgiving flashed through my mind. Dad pushing, Daniel going quiet, me stepping in, everyone else stepping back. From 3 hours away, the pattern looked simpler than it ever had from inside it. I took the impact, so other people did not have to. Beth was waiting. I could hear it in her breathing. She expected me to start collecting details, what Dad had said, where Daniel was, what everyone had already tried. Those would have been reasonable questions, and also the first steps back into the job. I looked down at my empty hand. For once, I had brought nothing to a Christmas gathering except myself. I decided not to leave with someone else's argument. I told Beth I loved her. I told her I was sorry the night had turned ugly. Then I said the part that felt almost physically difficult to say. You wanted to handle Christmas without me. You can handle Dad without me too. The silence on the other end changed. It was not anger so much as shock. I could picture Beth sitting somewhere away from the others, probably with one hand over her forehead, expecting the old Audrey to take control. I hated knowing I had disappointed that expectation. She said I knew Dad better than anyone. That was probably true. It was also part of the problem. Knowing how to manage a person does not mean you should be responsible for managing him forever. I kept my answer short. I was not going to call him, and I did not turn the refusal into instructions for what Beth should do instead. Before we ended the call, I asked one more time whether Molly was safe and away from the argument. Beth said yes. That was enough. When the line went quiet, I stood in Leah's hallway with my phone still pressed to my ear. Guilt arrived before relief had a chance. The accusation that hurt most was the one I could make against myself. I was hurt. They had asked for help, and I had refused. For a moment, I could not tell whether I had held a boundary or simply found a cleaner name for punishment. Leah appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying 2 empty mugs. She took one look at my face and did not ask for the story. I told her only what mattered. My sister had called from the lodge because there was a family argument, and she wanted me to talk to Dad. Leah asked whether anyone was in danger. The same question I had asked Beth. I said no. She nodded once and said adults were allowed to have difficult conversations without outsourcing them to the person best at absorbing the damage. Then she carried the mugs toward the kitchen. I had been waiting for permission to either rescue my family or abandon them. Leah offered neither. I put my phone on silent and went back into the living room. For a while, I barely heard the conversation around me. My attention remained 3 hours north, imagining ways the night might get worse and wondering who would blame me if it did. The urge to check my phone kept returning, but the only thing waiting there was uncertainty. I stayed through dessert. I helped carry my own plate to the kitchen and stopped there. When somebody across the room disagreed with Leah about the rules of a game, I felt the familiar twitch to smooth it over and then caught myself. They handled it. Nobody needed me. The world kept refusing to collapse. By the time I left Leah's house, the air had turned colder. I sat in my car beneath the porch light with the dark screen of my phone in my hand, knowing one call could put me back in the middle. Instead, I started the car. Guilt rode beside me all the way home, even though I had finally let them handle their own problem, and I had absolutely no idea what they were going to do next. It was a little after 10 when my phone rang. I had been home long enough to change clothes and leave the phone face down on the kitchen counter, refusing to turn Christmas Eve into a live feed from the lodge. Beth had already told me Molly was safe. Whatever happened next belonged to the adults who were there. Still, the apartment felt flatter after Leah's dinner, and Beth's request kept returning to me. Can you just talk to Dad? Then Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. Daniel's voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the joking tone he used whenever conversations came too close to something real. Faint winter air moved around him, enough to tell me he had stepped outside. He asked one question. Did you choose not to come? Everything in me went still. He was asking about the one fact the entire trip had been built around. I told him no. Then I gave him only the truth I personally owned. Dad had told me directly that the family wanted one Christmas without the tension I brought. I had never said I needed space after Thanksgiving. I had never told Dad I had other plans. I had not declined an invitation because there had never been one. Daniel said nothing for several seconds. I did not fill the silence. That was harder than it sounds. I let the truth sit there without softening Dad's motives or managing what Daniel might do with it. Eventually, Daniel told me what Dad had told him and Erica. According to Dad, I had needed space after Thanksgiving and already had other Christmas plans. He had made it sound like a mutual decision, or at least one nobody needed to question. Daniel admitted he had believed it because it fit the version of Thanksgiving he already had in his head. I had been upset. Dad had been upset. Distance had seemed plausible. That part hurt, but not because it was surprising. It hurt because it explained how little verification my absence had required. Dad did not need to invent a complicated lie. He only needed to give everyone a story comfortable enough that they would not ask me. Daniel said Beth had heard essentially the same explanation. Hearing Daniel recognize the inconsistency himself changed the moment. I was not building a case or telling him what the lie meant. I was answering the question he had chosen to ask. When the impulse came to connect every piece for him, I let it pass. He asked whether I had known everyone believed I had chosen not to come. I told him I had learned that from Beth after Molly called me. The rest did not need elaboration. Daniel breathed out slowly. Something inside that house had become inconsistent enough that he had stepped outside and gone to the source instead of accepting another explanation from Dad. I waited. Daniel did not ask me what he should do. For once, I was grateful. He said only, "Okay, I needed to know." The sentence carried more weight than it should have. There was no accusation or plan in his voice, only the discomfort of discovering that staying neutral had depended on accepting somebody else's version without checking. I wanted to ask what was happening inside the lodge, but swallowed the question. I told Daniel I hoped the boys were okay. He said they were. We ended the call. Daniel had simply asked the question everyone should have asked before leaving town, "Did you choose not to come?" And the answer had changed the shape of the night. I set the phone down again. This time, silence felt different. Before Daniel's call, I had imagined the family at the lodge as one united group. Now I could see the simpler truth. Each of them had choices to make about what they accepted from Dad, and none of those choices belonged to me. I went to the bedroom and pulled back the covers. My phone stayed on the dresser instead of beside the pillow. Part of me expected it to ring again. It did not. That should have been easier. Instead, I lay awake longer than I wanted to admit, listening to the building settle around me and wondering what Daniel would do when he walked back inside. I had given Daniel the truth, without giving him instructions. What he did with it was his decision. For the first time, another Bennett was walking back into the room with the truth, and I was not going with him. I woke before sunrise on Christmas morning, with the vague, disoriented feeling that I had forgotten something. For a few seconds, I lay still in the dark and listened to the quiet of my apartment. The building had a different sound on holidays. Fewer pipes running, fewer doors opening. Somewhere far below, tires moved slowly over cold pavement, then faded. Then I remembered Jasper. Molly's note was still folded in my bag near the front door, and the promise I had made to her gave the morning a simple direction again. I dressed without checking my phone. Daniel had not called back during the night. Neither had Beth. I did not know what had happened after he walked back into that lodge with the truth. I had spent enough of Christmas Eve imagining outcomes I could not verify, and I was determined not to begin Christmas Day the same way. The sky was only beginning to lighten when I drove through Beth's neighborhood. Porch lights glowed against the blue-gray morning. A few houses already had kitchen lights on, the kind of early activity that meant children had been awake before their parents wanted them to be. Beth's house should have been dark. It was not. The first thing I noticed was the car in the driveway, Ryan's. I slowed before pulling in, my hands tightening around the steering wheel. For one irrational second, I wondered whether I had gotten the day wrong. Then I saw the luggage. Through the front window, behind the half-open curtain, 2 suitcases sat near the living room wall. I stayed in the car longer than necessary. Nothing about the sight was dramatic. No broken window, no emergency vehicle, no one running outside. Just a car that should have been 3 hours away. I got out. Before I reached the door, it opened. Ryan stood there in a gray sweatshirt, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug. He looked like he had slept very little. There was no surprise in his face when he saw me, only fatigue. He stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and cold air trapped in coats. Jasper appeared immediately, weaving around my ankles with the self-importance of someone who believed the entire morning had been organized for him. The suitcases I had seen through the window were real. Molly's winter coat had been dropped over the arm of a chair. One of Ryan's gloves lay on the floor near the entryway. There was a paper cup from a gas station sitting on the side table. They had come home fast. I looked toward the stairs. Ryan lowered his voice and told me Molly was asleep. She had stayed awake for most of the drive, then fallen asleep less than 20 minutes before they reached home. Beth was in the kitchen. I followed Jasper there. She sat at the table with both hands around a mug she did not seem to be drinking from. Her hair was pulled back badly, strands loose around her face. She looked up when I entered, and something in her expression made me stop. Not because she looked angry, because she looked ashamed. I set my bag on the counter and took care of Jasper first. The familiar routine gave Beth time to decide what she wanted to say without me dragging it out of her. When I finished, Jasper followed me back to the table. I sat across from Beth. She did not begin with Dad. She began with herself. Beth said that after I refused to call him, the argument at the lodge had not ended. It had only changed shape. Dad kept insisting she had become too sensitive and that everyone was turning normal comments into attacks. Daniel had left the room for a while. I knew that part. I told her Daniel had called me. Beth nodded. Then she told me what happened after he went back inside. Daniel had gone back inside and asked why Dad had told everyone I chose not to come. Beth said Dad hesitated, then tried to recast his lie as a simplification. Thanksgiving had been strained. I clearly wanted distance, and he had only spared everyone another argument. Daniel answered that I had never said any of that, and Beth admitted Dad had given her the same story. No one in the room had ever heard me decline the trip. Dad tried to turn the focus back toward my behavior, but for once I was not there to argue with him. There was no call for me to blame, no confrontation I had started. The room had to stay with the original question. Beth told Dad he had spent the day correcting Molly, and then calling her oversensitive when she objected. Daniel brought up Thanksgiving and admitted something I had not expected from him. He had been angry when I stepped over him with Owen, but he had also benefited when Dad's attention shifted to me. Ryan said the pattern looked even clearer from outside the Bennett family. The damage came first. Then everyone treated the effort to recover from it as the disruption. Dad accused all of them of ruining Christmas. Beth looked at me across the table. Her voice was quieter when she repeated what she had said to him. "No, we just stopped letting Audrey be the reason we don't say any of this to you." The kitchen seemed to shrink around the sentence. Jasper jumped into my lap, and I rested one hand against his back. I had imagined vindication as something cleaner than what I felt then. There was relief, but grief sat beside it. The grief of realizing how long the pattern had lasted before any of us named our place inside it. Beth said Dad had become furious after that. Not violent, not threatening, just deeply offended by the idea that everyone else could suddenly agree on a version of the family that did not place him at the center as the reasonable one. He kept insisting they were overreacting. Beth decided she was done arguing. More importantly, she decided Molly was done being there for it. Ryan agreed immediately. They packed what they needed, woke Molly enough to get her into the car, and left shortly after midnight. The drive took about 3 hours. Molly stayed awake for most of it, confused but not asking much. Beth and Ryan told her only that the adults had gotten upset and that going home was the better choice. Daniel and Erica made a different decision. With both boys tired and the roads dark, they drove only far enough to find a nearby hotel. They would return home later in the day. Dad stayed at the lodge alone. He had wanted quiet and one Christmas without me. By the early hours of Christmas morning, he had almost no one left to share it with. Beth looked down at her hands. Then she did something I had not expected. She stopped talking about Dad. She said she was sorry. Not sorry that the trip had gone badly. Not sorry that I had found out. Sorry that when Dad gave her an explanation for my absence, she accepted it because accepting it was easier than checking with me. She told herself that I wanted space, because that meant she did not have to ask why I was missing from a family Christmas. She chose convenience over courage. There was no defense attached and no request that I tell her everything was fine. I thought about Thanksgiving and told Beth she had been right about one thing. I did step in too quickly sometimes. Dad had used that tendency against me, but that did not make it imaginary. I could own the part of the pattern that belonged to me without accepting responsibility for everyone else's. Jasper shifted in my lap and pressed one paw against my sweater. For once, there was nothing I needed to fix before leaving the room. Then my phone rang. Dad's name lit the screen. Dad's name glowed against the dark screen in my hand, while Jasper settled more heavily across my lap. For a second, nobody in Beth's kitchen moved. Ryan stood near the counter with his coffee. Beth watched me from across the table, exhausted enough that even her worry looked quiet. Upstairs, the house remained still. Molly had finally fallen asleep after 3 hours in a car on Christmas morning, and I was not going to let whatever Dad wanted drag her back into the center of something that belonged to adults. I lifted Jasper gently onto the chair beside me and stood. There had been a time when seeing Dad's name after a family disaster would have sent me somewhere private, rehearsing how to calm him and which version of the truth he could tolerate. The reflex was still there. It just no longer felt like an instruction. I stepped into Beth's hallway and answered. Dad was not shouting. That somehow made the anger easier to hear. His voice had the tight, controlled quality it took on when he believed other people had embarrassed him. He said everyone had overreacted. Beth had taken Molly and left in the middle of the night. Daniel had dragged Erica and the boys to a hotel. Christmas had been turned into a spectacle over a few comments nobody would remember in a week. Then he blamed me. Not directly at first. He circled it the way he always did, describing how strange it was that everything had been fine until people started talking to me, how convenient it was that I had stayed away and still somehow ended up at the center of the collapse. He finally said I had gotten what I wanted. I looked through the open doorway toward Beth's kitchen. Her suitcases were still against the living room wall. Ryan's glove remained on the floor where it had fallen. There was no triumph anywhere in that house. Just tired people who had driven through the night because staying had become worse than leaving. I did not argue with Dad's version point by point. I told him the only facts that mattered. I had not told Beth to leave or Daniel to confront him. I had not called anyone first. I had done exactly what he had asked me to do. I stayed away. The silence that followed was different from the pauses he used when he wanted me to fill them. This one sounded like he had reached the edge of his own explanation and found nowhere else to put the blame. Then he said, "You knew what would happen without you." The sentence stopped me because for years I had behaved as though it were true. I had rushed into conversations, redirected Dad, called afterward, repaired afterward. Somewhere along the way, prevention had become proof of necessity. Until this Christmas, I had never actually known what would happen if I stopped. "No, Dad," I said. I spent years making sure none of us ever found out. I left the sentence alone. He tried to pull the conversation back toward intention. He had wanted a peaceful Christmas. He had wanted people to relax. He had not forced anyone to leave. The old method had simply stopped working. When he asked what I expected everyone to do now, I recognized the opening. He was handing me the problem again. A month earlier, I would have started building a path back toward family peace. This time, I told him I did not know what everyone should do, because I was no longer going to decide for them. If he wanted to repair things with Beth, he needed to speak to Beth. If he wanted a relationship with Daniel that did not depend on me standing between them, he had to listen to Daniel. The same applied to Ryan, Erica, Owen, Molly, Mason. I would speak to him as his daughter. I would not manage his relationships with the rest of the family. Dad went quiet again. I could hear movement faintly on his end, perhaps a chair or a cupboard. I pictured the lodge for the first time without inventing people inside it. Snow outside, fireplace cooling, too many bedrooms, Christmas morning arriving around one man who had asked for quiet and finally gotten more of it than he intended. I did not feel sorry enough to rescue him from it, and I did not enjoy it either. I ended the call without a speech about consequences. The consequences were already there. Contact with Dad stayed limited through January, and nobody pretended Christmas had been resolved. Beth did not become fearless overnight. Daniel did not turn into someone who wanted long, emotional conversations, and Dad never delivered a perfect apology. What changed first were the small habits. Beth stopped calling me after difficult conversations with Dad to ask what she should say next. She still told me when something bothered her, but the story no longer ended with a request that I fix it. Daniel began answering Dad himself. The first time Beth mentioned that, she almost sounded surprised. Dad had criticized one of Daniel's decisions, and instead of ignoring it until I got involved, Daniel had told him directly where the boundary was. Nobody asked me to mediate. Family plans changed too. Dad was still our father, but his preferences stopped functioning, like default settings. Beth and Daniel answered for themselves instead of waiting to see what he wanted first. By late January, Beth offered one cautious Sunday lunch at her house and invited all of us, Dad included. I almost arrived early. The impulse came automatically. I pictured Beth in the kitchen, Ryan trying to manage something in the oven, Molly underfoot, extra chairs still folded somewhere. My hand was already on my keys when I stopped. Beth had told me noon, so I arrived at noon. The house was noisy when I walked in. Molly was showing Mason something on her tablet. Owen had a robotics shirt on under an open hoodie. Erica was carrying plates from the kitchen. Daniel was attempting to slice bread with more confidence than skill. Dad was already seated. No one looked at me like relief had finally arrived, and I found that strangely comforting. Lunch itself was not magical. Dad was quieter than usual, but not transformed. He still carried a little defensiveness in the way he listened, as if every disagreement might become evidence against him. Near the end of the meal, Owen mentioned an upcoming robotics event that conflicted with another family activity. Dad made a mild comment about Daniel letting a teenager reorganize the family schedule around a hobby. It was not the worst thing he had ever said, which was precisely why the moment mattered. I felt the old reflex immediately. My attention shifted toward Owen, then Daniel. I already knew the sentence I could use to redirect Dad before the comment hardened into something larger. I opened my mouth, then stopped. Daniel set down his fork. He did not look at me. He told Dad calmly that the decision about Owen's schedule belonged to him, Erica, and Owen. There was no lecture and no fight. Dad looked displeased, but the disagreement stayed between the people it belonged to. Beth kept eating. Erica reached for the bread. Owen stayed at the table, and nobody looked to me. The moment passed. I sat there with my hands resting in my lap and felt something loosen that I had been carrying for so long. I had stopped recognizing its weight. Dad wanted one Christmas without me. What he got was one Christmas without the person who had been carrying everybody else's silence. I never picked that weight up again.